April 13th, 1944, 1,430 hours. The war-torn skies over northern Germany were crowded with contrails' long white scars that told stories of pursuit and exhaustion. For the American pilot of the P-51B Mustang that staggered through the thin spring air, those contrails were fading fast. His fuel gauge needle had long since dropped below reserve. The Merlin engine, coughing on the last fumes of high-octane avgas, began to sputter. Below him, a patchwork of green fields stretched across Lower Saxony, threaded by narrow roads and bordered by copses of bare trees just beginning to bloom again after winter. The pilot, Lieutenant Robert F. Smith of the 354th Fighter Group, had been escorting B-17 seconds returning from a strike on Hanover. His squadron had tangled with a swarm of Focke-Wulf 190 seconds somewhere over the Weser Valley. His section broke formation to chase a pair of diving Germans, but the fight carried them far east of the bomber's route home. When the dogfight ended, his ammunition belts were almost empty, his oxygen low, and his radio silent. His wingman was gone. Then the Merlin began to falter. At 4,000 feet, Smith switched to emergency on the fuel selector nothing. He throttled back and trimmed for glide, scanning for open land. A small meadow stretched beside a railway embankment, its grass uneven but free of trees. He lowered the gear, too fast, felt the left tire catch, the right wing dip. The Mustang bounced once, then slammed down hard. Metal screamed, dust rose, and silence followed. The propeller blades curled under like broken fingers, but the aircraft serial number 43 to 12101 remained miraculously whole. Villagers reached the wreck within minutes. By the time the local Luftwaffe police arrived, the American pilot had vanished into the hedgerows, heading west. He was captured 2 days later near Osnabrück, exhausted and unarmed. But the real prize lay in that field, the first intact P-51B to fall into German hands. The next morning, a convoy of trucks from Jagdgeschwader 26 arrived to secure the aircraft. Photographs taken that day, preserved in Luftwaffe archives, show mechanics standing beside the crumpled propeller, one man resting a boot on the spinner as if posing with a hunted animal. The American insignia on the wings was still bright against the olive drab. By dusk, the Mustang had been partially disassembled, its wings removed and fuselage loaded onto a flatbed bound for the Luftwaffe Test and Evaluation Center at Rechlin. The journey would take 2 days. The machine was tagged Beautyflugzeug P-51B, Merlin engine transport with care. Rechlin, on the shores of the Müritz Sea, was the beating heart of German aeronautical intelligence. Every captured aircraft, from Spitfires to flying fortresses, passed through its hangars. The men who worked there were equal parts scientists and undertakers dissecting enemy technology to learn how it lived and why it killed. When the Mustang arrived on April 16th, 1944, word spread quickly. Engineers from the Luftfahrtforschungsanstalt at Braunschweig and from the Technische Amt in Berlin travelled to see the new arrival. The first inspection began at dawn. Under harsh white lights, the Mustang stood stripped of its outer panels, its skin peeled away like armor. The technicians moved methodically, measuring, sketching, noting. One team traced the outline of the wing onto drafting paper, surprised by its unfamiliar contour. The airfoil was almost symmetrical, its thickest point far aft, what the Americans called a laminar-flow wing. The Germans had heard rumors of such designs, but never touched one. Ingenious, wrote Oberingenieur Karl Bartels in his log. Minimal drag, simple structure, built for mass production. They have mastered what we theorized. The second revelation came from the engine bay. The Rolls-Royce Merlin 61, built under license by Packard in Detroit, was not exotic, it was precise. The accessory layout was logical, the fuel and coolant lines labelled, and every removable panel secured by identical fasteners. The supercharger assembly drew admiration and envy in equal measure. Its 2-stage, 2-speed system allowed the Mustang to breathe easily at 30,000 feet, where German engines gasped. "This is an engineer's aircraft," Bartels noted. "Ours are pilot's aircraft. theirs are systems. When the team reassembled the Mustang for ground tests, Luftwaffe mechanics added conspicuous yellow paint to its underside and tail, a warning to flak batteries that this was no enemy intruder. They stenciled T9 plus CK in black letters along the fuselage, marking it as property of Zirkus Rosarius, the traveling evaluation unit that toured frontline airfields to demonstrate Allied aircraft. The first engine run took place on April 21st. The Rechlin staff assembled outside the hangar, hands over ears, as the starter motor whined, and the Merlin coughed once, twice, then came alive. A deep, even growl rolled across the airfield. Unlike the sharp bark of a Daimler-Benz 605 or the guttural roar of a BMW 801, this was a smooth, balanced thrum, measured and confident. One technician compared it to a sewing machine, relentless, precise, without vibration. When the throttle advanced, the entire hangar vibrated with controlled fury. No one spoke. In that moment, the Mustang ceased to be a curiosity. It was a revelation. The German officers watching knew instinctively that this aircraft represented something larger than airframe and engine. It was a product of a system that could design, manufacture, and field a machine so refined it seemed effortless. The flight tests began a week later. Hauptmann Hans Werner Lerche, one of the Luftwaffe's most experienced test pilots, took the Mustang aloft for its maiden German flight. His report survives in fragments within the Bundesarchiv. Controls light and balanced, stability excellent, cockpit visibility exceptional, rolls rapidly, without excessive force. Performance at altitude extraordinary, maintains climb rate, where Bf 109G begins to lose power. Engine runs flawlessly. But Lerche's final remark was the most damning. This aircraft feels finished, not improved in haste, but conceived complete. The Mustang's presence at Rechlin became something of a pilgrimage. Pilots from neighboring units arrived to see the captured legend, their attitudes shifting from ridicule to respect. They walked around the sleek fuselage, tracing the unbroken curve of its wing roots, peering into the spacious cockpit with its padded seat and clear bubble canopy. The ergonomic arrangement of switches, the simple reflector gun sight, and the sturdy hydraulic controls all told the same story. The Americans had designed a fighter that could be flown by thousands of men, not just aces. Within weeks, copies of the technical drawings and translated manuals circulated through the Luftwaffe's research departments. Discussions began about adapting elements of the Mustang, its cooling system, its long-range tanks, its clean airframe to German designs. But it was too late. The Reich's factories were already choked by shortages. Its engineers, brilliant though they were, could not conjure aluminum or fuel from bombed-out infrastructure. When Zirkus Rosarius took the Mustang on tour in the summer of 1944, painted in Luftwaffe markings, it drew crowds wherever it landed. German pilots who had once scoffed at the Yankee toys now watched in silence as the captured P-51 accelerated down the runway and soared effortlessly into the blue. The yellow-bellied ghost of American industry roared above them, a flying prophecy of their defeat. By the time it taxied back and the propeller blades wound down, the realization was complete. They had been fighting not just a machine, but an idea, a way of building airplanes that united science, standardization, and scale. The Mustang was not the fastest or most agile fighter in the world. It was something rarer, a complete solution. And as the last tremor of the Merlin faded into the spring air, one German engineer was heard to whisper, almost with reverence, 20 Jahre voraus, 20 years ahead, April 25th, 1944. Hangar 3, Erprobungsstelle Rechlin. The Mustang stood stripped bare like a specimen on a surgeon's table, every panel removed, every cable tagged. Around it, teams of Luftwaffe engineers and civilian technicians circled with calipers, notebooks, and disbelief. The air smelled of oil, cigarette smoke, and curiosity. Oberingenieur Karl Bartels, the senior structural analyst from the Luftfahrtforschungsanstalt, began his morning report with the sentence that would appear in dozens of later memos. This aircraft is not complicated, it is correct. That phrase would be underlined 3 times by his superiors in Berlin. The Germans were used to complexity. Every Messerschmitt and Focke-Wulf carried the fingerprints of individual craftsmen hand-fit panels, irregular welds, unique fittings. The Mustang was the opposite. The closer they looked, the more they saw repetition, standardization, and logic. The rivet spacing along the fuselage skin was mathematically perfect. The control surface hinges were identical across all moving parts: elevator, aileron, rudder. One hinge, one system, one drawing, Bartels wrote. They build airplanes as if they were typewriters. The laminar-flow wing fascinated them most. German aerodynamicists had theorized similar shapes before the war, but none had entered production. The Mustang's wing was built from a precise contour that delayed the airflow's transition from laminar to turbulent farther back along the chord, reducing drag dramatically. When the engineers ran their fingers over the wing's polished aluminum skin, they found joints flush to within fractions of a millimeter. Each panel was smooth, unbroken, sealed with compound. No raised rivet heads to disturb the airflow. Professor Hans-Dieter Koch, visiting from Göttingen, studied the wing's geometry with a draftsman's reverence. "We calculated this in 1938, he murmured, but we said it could not be built. Now he was staring at proof that the Americans had not only built it, they had standardized it. In the engine bay, another revelation awaited. The Packard-built Merlin V16503 rested on its mounts like a jewel. German mechanics had fought the Merlin over the Channel in Spitfires, but never seen one in daylight. Its twin-stage, 2-speed supercharger was a mechanical labyrinth, and yet, when dismantled, its logic was plain. Everything was labelled, colour-coded, and accessible. The coolant header tank unscrewed with a single tool. The magneto covers bore engraved serial numbers matching their logbooks. The hydraulic lines were bent with machine precision, each curve identical, each bracket stamped P-51B. The Luftwaffe engineers were astonished less by performance than by philosophy. Their own Daimler-Benz 605 engines were masterpieces of metallurgy, but demanded skilled labour and obsessive maintenance. The Merlin was designed for volume and field service. It was rugged, forgiving, and interchangeable. You could change this engine on a muddy field in 2 hours, Bartels wrote, and it would run. They catalogued everything: the drop tank plumbing, self-sealing fuel lines, and venting system that allowed 1,600-kilometer escort range. The coolant radiator duct with its Meredith effect, an innovation so efficient that it produced thrust from heated air rather than drag. When the engineers tested it in the wind tunnel, they confirmed the impossible. At cruise power, the radiator actually added forward thrust. One team examined the cockpit layout. The visibility was revolutionary. Unlike the greenhouse canopies of German fighters, the Mustang's high seat and sliding hood gave unobstructed sightlines in all directions. "Our pilots fight blind in comparison," a Luftwaffe officer muttered. The instrument panel was arranged by function: engine, navigation, armament, radio. Each gauge clear, standardized, luminous. The control stick was balanced, the rudder pedals adjustable. Even the heating and defrosting systems, trivial luxuries to the German eye, revealed an American obsession with pilot endurance. Then came the guns. 6 Browning, 50 caliber machine guns lined the wings, each with belt feeds that curved through sealed boxes into the breeches. The ammunition capacity, 1,880 rounds, seemed absurd to men accustomed to 120-round cannon drums. When fired, the guns produced a sustained torrent of fire for nearly 20 seconds. The test range at Rechlin recorded that the weapon dispersion formed an oval roughly 6 feet wide at 300 meters, an industrial-scale killing zone. "No finesse required," an officer remarked grimly. "Just point and erase." Everywhere they looked, they found layers of intention. The radio was crystal-controlled and self-tuning, immune to interference. The oxygen regulator used pressure compensation that kept the pilot lucid at altitudes where German flyers struggled with headaches. Even the battery placement beneath the pilot's seat for center of gravity stability had been carefully reasoned. When the Rechlin team compared the Mustang's maintenance manuals with their own aircraft documentation, the contrast was embarrassing. The American technical orders were written in simple, direct English, with diagrams, part numbers, and torque values. German manuals, dense with handwritten updates and jargon, assumed expert understanding. The Mustang's manual assumed a farmhand who had learned quickly. By early May 1944, the engineers' reports filled binders. One was classified Geheime Kommandosache P-51, Untersuchung, Teil 2, Fertigung und Instandsetzung. Its conclusion read, "This aircraft is designed not for the craftsman but for the factory. It is built for a nation that fights with production." In Berlin, General Feldmarschall Erhard Milch read the summary and scrawled a note in the margin. "Learn from this, but we are out of time." The next phase would move from bench to sky. The reassembled Mustang, its new paint gleaming under the Rechlin sun, bore Luftwaffe codes T9 plus CK on its fuselage and bright yellow bands under the wings to warn friendly gunners. The propeller blades, newly fitted Hamilton Standard units scavenged from the wreck of another captured aircraft, waited for their test. When the engine started, the sound rolled across the airfield again, deep and confident. Test pilot Hauptmann Hans-Werner Lerche climbed aboard, adjusted the seat, and closed the canopy. As the Mustang taxied out, the German engineers stood silent, clipboards forgotten. The captured machine lifted smoothly, climbing at a rate that left even the newest Bf-109 G6 behind. Its contrail traced a slow spiral into the northern sky, a white question mark above the hangars. Down below, Bartels watched until it vanished, then turned to his assistant. "They have built the future," he said quietly, "and we are still refining the past." May 4th, 1944. The morning air above Rechlin was thin and sharp, a perfect laboratory. Test pilot Hauptmann Hans-Werner Lerche climbed into the cockpit of the P-51B now officially marked T9 plus CK, its yellow-painted undersides glaring like warning stripes in the sun. The ground crew secured the canopy, stepped clear, and signaled the all clear. Lerche eased the throttle forward. The Merlin engine's deep hum swelled to a clean, resonant roar that echoed across the lake. Every eye on the tarmac followed the strange, foreign shape as it began its roll. The acceleration was astonishing. Unlike the German inline engines, the Merlin produced smooth, relentless thrust without coughing or backfiring. The Mustang lifted its nose, unhurried but unstoppable, and climbed away at a steep angle. Within seconds, it was a silver gleam against the blue. The Rechlin team had drawn up a meticulous flight program. They would test the Mustang's climb, dive, roll rate, and fuel economy at successive altitudes, then compare the data to the Luftwaffe's standard fighters, the Bf-109 G6 and the FW-190A8. On paper, the Mustang seemed unremarkable, slower than the Messerschmitt at low altitude, less agile than the Focke-Wulf in a turn. But in flight, the numbers began to reveal something else. At 25,000 feet, the P-51 held 1,600 horsepower, its supercharger still delivering sea-level pressure, while the BMW 801 of the W190 had already lost nearly a quarter of its power. Lerche recorded in his log, "Climb rate constant to 30,000 feet, engine smooth. German fighters cannot maintain contact above 8,000 meters." The test observers timed the ascent. 5 minutes, 54 seconds to 30,000 feet, with coolant and oil temperatures steady. No German aircraft in 1944 could match that sustained climb. Next came the high-speed dive tests. At 32,000 feet, Lerche rolled the Mustang inverted and nosed down at 45 degrees. The altimeter unwound in a blur. The airspeed indicator touched 500 miles per hour, then 540. Unlike the Bf-109, whose controls locked solid in compressibility, the Mustang's elevators remained manageable. Buffeting mild, recovery at 10,000 feet normal, aircraft stable, he wrote. When engineers later examined the gun camera footage from the test, They saw the control stick vibrating, slightly evidence of airflow separation, delayed far longer than any German design could achieve. The laminar-flow wing was doing its work. Lurch's running commentary through the intercom was transmitted and recorded. "This machine is heavy but harmonious," he said. "It behaves like a bomber in weight but like a fighter in control. The stability in dive is unmatched. The Germans will not outdive it. They cannot." Back on the ground, fuel flow data astounded the TARM engineers. With external drop tanks, the Mustang consumed barely 60 gallons per hour at cruise power, less than half the rate of a Bf-109G at comparable altitude. When plotted against distance, the results drew gasps. A combat radius of nearly 700 miles on internal fuel alone, stretching to 1,300 with two 75-gallon wing tanks. On the wall map of Europe, an engineer drew a circle centered on southern England. It reached Berlin. "This," said Bartels, tapping the map, "is the end of the Reich's air defense. They will fly from England to here, fight, and fly home, every day." The armament trials came next. Firing runs over the Baltic test range showed 6. 50 caliber Brownings could maintain fire for 18 seconds, continuous 3 times longer than the average 20W190's 20mm cannon load. The gun camera film captured a line of shell splashes, marching across the water with surgical regularity. When the gunnery chief compared dispersion patterns, he concluded that the Americans had perfected harmonization. "They built this aircraft around the guns," he told the staff. "We build ours around the engine." In early June, the Mustang was flown side by side against a Bf-109G6. Both aircraft took off simultaneously, climbed to 8,000 meters, and engaged in mock combat. Observers on the ground tracked their positions through binoculars. The Messerschmitt could outturn the Mustang in a flat circle, but each time it tried to climb, the American fighter simply pulled away. When they dived, the 109 began to shudder, and its controls stiffened, forcing it to level out. The Mustang stayed smooth, regained altitude, and settled behind the German fighter's tail every time. After landing, the Messerschmitt pilot threw down his gloves. "At low altitude we might survive," he said, "but above 7,000 meters, we are target practice." The final test, conducted on May 28th, measured range under simulated escort conditions. Lurch flew at 260 miles per hour for 5 hours, circling between Berlin and Hamburg. When he landed, the Mustang still carried reserve fuel. The flight engineer's notes summed up the result in one line: "Endurance exceeds any single-seat fighter known to us." When all the data were compiled into a formal report, Rechlin Evaluation Number 2347, P-51B, its conclusions were sobering. The Mustang could fight effectively at altitudes the Luftwaffe could not reach, outlast any interceptor in the air, and strike deep into Germany while defending itself on equal or better terms. The combination of performance, range, and firepower created a new category altogether: the long-range strategic fighter. In early June, copies of the report reached the Technische Amt in Berlin and the headquarters of the Luftwaffe General der Jagdflieger. One margin note, written in a frustrated scrawl beside the performance tables, read, "It is not merely an aircraft, it is a system of war." At Rechlin, the mood was quiet. The mechanics gathered around the parked Mustang in the evening light, its yellow belly glowing softly against the darkening sky. Someone ran a hand along the fuselage, tracing the smooth line from spinner to tail. "They built this for mass," Bartels said finally. "We build for mastery. They will win with mathematics." The next morning, the captured P-51 would begin a new life as a traveling exhibit of the Zirkus Rosarius, a bright yellow ghost sent to warn the Luftwaffe's frontline pilots of what awaited them in the high, thin air above the Reich. But the engineers who had seen it fly already knew the truth. The future had come, and it wore American stars. June 10th, 1944. Rechlin Airfield, Mecklenburg. The P-51B, now repainted in glaring Reich colors, the belly chrome yellow and tail striped with red, taxied to the flight line under a low ceiling of summer clouds. Black code letters T9 plus CK stood out against the olive-drab fuselage, the last traces of its American star barely visible beneath the new paint. The yellow ghost had been reborn as part of Zirkus Rosarius, the Luftwaffe's traveling evaluation unit that toured operational airfields to educate frontline pilots on Allied aircraft. The men who prepared the Mustang that morning treated it with quiet reverence. It had ceased to be a mere captured machine. It was now a teacher, a warning, and unspoken but deeply felt a reminder of a war already slipping from Germany's control. Hauptmann Theodor Rosarius, commander of the Special Staff, inspected the aircraft personally. "Make sure they understand," he told Lerche. "This is what they face now." The first demonstration took place at Fassberg, home of Jagdgeschwader 1. The pilots gathered in groups around the foreign machine, laughing at first, then falling silent as Lerche began his briefing. He spoke like an instructor rather than a showman. "This is the Mustang," he began. "Built in America by North American Aviation, engine by Packard, under license from Rolls-Royce. It is powered by industry, not genius. That is its strength." He walked them through every surface, pointing out the wing's laminar design, the drop tank system, the cooling duct, the self-sealing fuel cells. When the ground crew opened the engine cowling, the Luftwaffe pilots leaned closer, tracing the color-coded lines and machine-pressed fittings. "Everything is numbered," one muttered. "They think of the mechanic before the pilot." Then came the flight demonstration. Lerche climbed in, adjusted the seat, and ran through the start checklist. The Merlin caught on the first rotation. The sound was smoother, quieter than any Daimler-Benz. The Mustang rolled down the runway, lifted, and began a series of passes, low, fast, precise. Its silhouette, long-nosed and graceful, seemed alien among the stubby 109 seconds and 190 seconds parked along the grass. When Lerche pulled into a vertical climb, the aircraft rose like an arrow until it vanished into cloud. Down, below, the Jagdgeschwader pilots exchanged glances. Oberleutnant Heinz Marquardt, an ace with 12 victories, shook his head. "We can't chase that. Not up there." Rosarius said nothing. The Mustang reappeared in a screaming dive, leveled at treetop height, then roared overhead, the yellow underbelly blazing. It was both spectacle and prophecy. After landing, Lerche taxied to the lineup. Pilots swarmed the aircraft, bombarding him with questions: turn rate, dive limits, weaknesses. He answered with clinical honesty: avoid turning fights, never follow in climb. If you must engage, dive and brake before it does. It will always outlast you. A silence followed. The Luftwaffe had trained its men to believe in individual superiority, the ace, the artist of combat. The Mustang embodied something else entirely: systemic dominance. It was built so that thousands could fly it well enough, long enough, to overwhelm the gifted few. Throughout June and July, the Zirkus Rosarius moved from airfield to airfield: Werneuchen, Wittmundhafen, Parchim. Everywhere it went, the reaction was the same: disbelief first, then grudging awe, then despair. Pilots touched the Mustang's skin like pilgrims before a relic. They copied down its performance figures, its armament layout, its range estimates, yet all understood the futility. "We could build one," a Fokker-Wulf engineer said to Lerche at Parchim, "but we could not build 10,000. At each base, intelligence officers appended notes from captured reports of American long-range escort missions. By June 1944, the Mustangs were flying daily from England to Berlin and back, protecting bomber streams that filled the sky from horizon to horizon. For the first time, Germany's airfields were under constant watch. Its fighter pilots were hunted even before takeoff. In one of the Zirkus lectures, a projection screen showed reconnaissance photos of the Leipzig oil plants before and after recent raids. The before image showed a sprawling complex of storage tanks and pipework. The after image was a cratered wasteland. "Escorted all the way," Rosarius said. "P-51 seconds from East Anglia to Leipzig. No losses to flak. Our interceptors never reached them." The room stayed silent. Back at Rechlin, technicians logged hundreds of test hours. They examined fuel efficiency curves, drag coefficients, control harmonization, all data meant to improve German designs like the TAR-152 and Me-262. But the engineers knew the truth that statistics merely confirmed. The Mustang's performance wasn't a miracle of design alone. It was the result of a nation that could design, test, build, and refine at industrial scale. By late July, T9 plus CK had become a celebrity. German newsreels shot footage of the aircraft taxiing beside a Bf-109G for comparison, though the film was never shown publicly. Propaganda ministers deemed it demoralizing. The contrast was too stark. The American fighter looked modern, aerodynamic, inevitable. The German machines looked like relics of an earlier war. On July 28th, the Mustang made its final demonstration flight at Rechlin before scheduled overhaul. During a simulated dogfight with a captured Spitfire Merc 9, it outclimbed and outrolled its British cousin, an irony that drew a few bitter smiles from the watching officers. The Merlin purred through every maneuver. When Lerche landed and shut down, a mechanic recorded that the engine temperature never exceeded 95 degrees Celsius. "Runs like a watch," he wrote, and has never been serviced since capture. That night, over cigarettes and weak coffee, Bartels made an entry in his private journal. "We have dissected the future," he wrote. "It is not mysterious. It is simply built by those who can afford to make perfection ordinary." By autumn, as the Zirkus Rosarius prepared to relocate to southern Germany, the captured Mustang had acquired a new nickname among Luftwaffe ground crews, Der Gelbe. Albtraum, the Yellow Nightmare. For the German airmen who had watched it climb and vanish into the sun, it was more than a trophy. It was a warning that the war in the air had already been decided not by courage or cunning, but by the quiet precision of factories an ocean away. August 1944. Berlin's once proud factories lay in ruins, their roofs peeled open like tin boxes. In the wreckage of the Henschel works at Spandau, amid the smell of scorched oil and brick dust, a small detachment from the Technische Amt worked under tarps and flickering lamps. The object of their study, what little still gleamed in the greyness, was the P-51B that had arrived from Rechlin in June. The reports from Zirkus Rosarius had filtered upward to the highest echelons of the Luftwaffe. Now the ministry wanted answers. They called it a technische Obduktion, a technical autopsy. Every rivet, bearing, and bracket was to be measured, drawn, and compared to its German equivalent. If the Mustang could not be matched, perhaps it could at least be imitated. Oberstleutnant Wilhelm Ossenberg, coordinator of the Jägerstab fighter staff, stood over the stripped fuselage, dictating notes to his stenographer. "Observe the construction method," he said, running a hand along the inner wing spar. "Not elegance, logic, each part interchangeable, machined, unambiguous. This is industry without artisans." He said the last word with disdain and envy in equal measure. Across the table, engineer Karl Bartels, transferred from Rechlin to the capital, spoke quietly. "The Americans have erased the craftsman," he said. "They replaced him with process. Their advantage is not the airplane, it's the blueprint that builds it 10,000 times." They began by weighing components. The Mustang's outer skin, 24 ST alclad aluminum, was lighter and more corrosion-resistant than Germany's 52 ST stock. Its control cables, coated with a new type of anti-friction compound, ran through, sealed pulleys instead of exposed guides. The cockpit's wiring looms were color-coded, bundled, and routed with machine regularity. Every German aircraft Bartels had worked on looked handmade beside it, imperfect, improvisational, personal. When they examined the cooling system, the engineers stopped to stare. The Mustang's ducted radiator, already known for its Meredith effect, contained subtle design details invisible in earlier field reports. The internal vanes redirected heated air precisely through the expansion duct, generating measurable thrust. In one test, they calculated that at 400 miles per hour, the cooling system alone contributed an equivalent of 150 horsepower. "They turn waste heat into propulsion," Bartels murmured. We are still wasting energy as if we had fuel to spare. Then came the manufacturing records. From captured documents and intercepted intelligence, they pieced together how the Mustang was produced. North American Aviation's factories in Inglewood and Dallas had employed over 50,000 workers, building P-51 seconds on assembly lines designed like automotive plants. Subassemblies arrived on rail cars, hourly wings, tails, engines, each pre-tested and ready to bolt on. A finished fighter rolled off the line every 90 minutes. In the dim Berlin workshop, Osenberg stared at the figures as if they were hallucination. "One every 90 minutes?" he repeated. "Our entire output last month was 92 aircraft." The implications spread through the Luftwaffe like an infection. Intelligence estimated that by summer 1944, the Allies were producing 2,000 P-51 seconds per month. Each had a range sufficient to escort bombers over Germany, and each cost less to build than a single Me-262 jet. Quantity had become quality. Even the Mustang's radio equipment told a story. The SCR-522 set was crystal locked, allowing squadrons to communicate on fixed frequencies without interference. German pilots still struggled with unreliable Fugue 16 sets, their dials slipping under vibration. "They can coordinate in combat while we shout over static," an officer complained. "They fight as networks, we fight as individuals." By late August, the technical autopsy was complete. The final report, Geheime Kommandosache nach 547, Untersuchung der P-51B Mustang, ran to 212 pages. Its conclusion was concise and devastating. The P-51 represents the synthesis of aerodynamics, manufacturing, and logistics. The design can be equaled theoretically, but not duplicated under present German conditions. The decisive factor is not technical knowledge, but industrial method. A copy reached Albert Speer's desk on September 2nd. He annotated the margins in blue pencil. "We understand the equation, but lack the factories to solve it." The surviving engineers at Rechlin received copies weeks later, along with new directives to incorporate Mustang principles into future designs. The TAR-152H, the Me-309 prototypes. But by then, the war had outrun innovation. Fuel shortages grounded test flights, aluminum allocations were halved, Allied bombers darkened the sky daily. In October, when Bartels visited Tempelhof for the last time, the Mustang lay dismantled on trestles. Its propeller hung on the wall like a relic. "What will happen to it?" he asked a mechanic. "They want the metal," the man said. "It will be melted down." Bartels touched the scarred fuselage, tracing the letters T9 plus CK, half peeled and faded. The surface was cold, smooth, almost alive. "It should be in a museum," he said. The mechanic gave a short, bitter laugh. "We are the museum." Weeks later, as Allied bombers roared overhead, the last fragments of the captured Mustang disappeared into the furnaces of a collapsing empire. Yet the engineers who had measured its wings and weighed its rivets carried the memory long after the war ended. In post-war interviews, several of them recalled the same moment. The first time the Merlin engine started, the even hum that silenced the hangar. "None of us said it aloud," Bartels told an Allied interrogator in 1946, "but we all felt it. That sound was the sound of a country that had already won." The P-51 had entered German history not as a weapon, but as a mirror reflecting what an industrial democracy could achieve when precision replaced passion and factories became instruments of strategy. For the men who studied it in Berlin's ruins, the lesson was not technological, it was existential. They had learned that the future did not belong to those who built beautifully, but to those who built endlessly. April 1945. The sky over northern Germany was an empty stage. For 6 years, it had roared with engines 109 seconds clawing for height, 190 seconds diving in fury, the drone of bombers, the staccato bark of flak. Now it was silent except for the distant rumble of Allied columns moving east. What remained of the Luftwaffe existed only on paper. Ghost squadrons without fuel, bases without aircraft, orders without purpose. At Fassberg, where the Zirkus Rosarius had once displayed its captured wonders, the hangars stood half-buried in rubble. The yellow-bellied Mustang, T9 plus CK, had long since been melted for scrap, but its legend persisted. Pilots who had once mocked it as a flying coffin now whispered about it like a superstition. "If you see one," a mechanic said, "the war is already lost." Oberingenieur Karl Bartels, grey now, thinner, but still in his oil-stained coat, remained at Rechlin, one of the few engineers not yet drafted into the Volkssturm. The base was under constant air alert. The sound of Merlin engines was a daily reminder of what they had studied too late. Each afternoon, P-51 Mustangs from the 355th Fighter Group swept across the lake, strafing anything that moved. Their invasion stripes glinted in the sunlight. Bartels would pause his work and look up, not in fear but in fascination. He knew their serial numbers by sight now. "That one's a D model," he'd mutter, watching a gleaming bubble canopy flash overhead. Shorter fuselage, fillet on the tail. They fixed the yaw instability. They keep improving. The German engineers had once prided themselves on invention. Now they were witnesses to evolution, relentless, mathematical, industrial. In a half-collapsed hangar, Bartels maintained a small collection of salvaged artifacts, a segment of laminar-flow wing, a Merlin carburetor, a gun sight from the American fighter they'd once dissected. To him, they were not trophies but fossils of a superior species. He had spent months writing reports that no one would ever read, technical memoranda, aerodynamic comparisons, pleas for standardization. "If we had 5 years," he told a colleague, "we could build a rival." The man laughed. "In 5 years, there will be no Germany to build it in." By mid-April, the British Second Army was approaching from the west. Rechlin's files were being burned. Aircraft were destroyed to prevent capture. A small group of engineers debated whether to surrender or flee south. Bartels chose to stay. "Someone must tell them what we learned," he said quietly. That evening, a formation of Mustangs passed over the base again, but this time they did not fire. They flew low and slow, their wingtips glittering in the dying light. One peeled away, rolled inverted, then climbed steeply into a vertical spiral, an almost ceremonial maneuver. Bartels watched until it vanished into the clouds. The next morning, the war ended for him in silence. No bombs, no orders, no speeches. Only the sound of wind through the skeletal hangars. He walked out to the runway, where wrecks of German fighters lay like carcasses, wings torn, engines seized. He picked up a fragment of yellow paint, perhaps once part of T9 plus CK, and turned it over in his hands. The color was still bright. In the months that followed, Allied investigators arrived at Rechlin. Among them was Captain Thomas B. Whitaker, an American engineer attached to the USAAF Technical Intelligence Section. Fluent in German, he had come to catalogue surviving research and locate captured Allied aircraft. When he met Bartels, he found a man who looked less like a defeated enemy than a weary scholar. "You were part of the Mustang study," Whitaker said, leafing through the German reports. "Yes," Bartels replied, "we learned a great deal." Whitaker smiled faintly. "So did we." They walked together through the ruins of the airfield. Whitaker stopped beside the twisted frame of a Fokker-Wulf 190. "You know," he said, "our pilots respected this one. They said it was the best-built enemy plane they ever fought." Bartels shook his head. "It was beautiful, yes, but beauty doesn't win wars. The Mustang was ugly in its perfection." He led Whitaker into the hangar where he had stored his collection. The American bent over the relic's wing section, ducting spent cartridge links, and whistled softly. "You kept souvenirs?" "Lessons," Bartels corrected, "for whoever rebuilds the world." When Whitaker returned weeks later, he brought a surprise, a glossy photograph of a restored P-51D sitting on an English airfield, its aluminum skin polished like a mirror. He handed it to Bartels. "We call it Big Beautiful Doll. Thought you might want to see how your old adversary looks in peacetime." Bartels studied the image for a long moment. "It's strange," he said. "We thought we were the engineers of the future, But it was them. They built machines that made other machines. We built one masterpiece at a time. They built a civilization. He placed the photograph among his notes and closed the folder. The Mustang was not a fighter, he said softly. It was a statement. By autumn, Rechlin was abandoned. The Allies dismantled the facilities. The Soviets took what remained. Bartels was sent west for debriefing, then quietly absorbed into civilian life. He would never design another aircraft. But in his small apartment in Hamburg, he kept one thing on his desk until his death in 1962, a single bullet casing from a .50 caliber Browning, recovered from the Rechlin test field. Visitors sometimes asked why he kept it. He would smile faintly. Because it sings, he'd say, tapping it with a pencil until it rang like a bell. That sound, that's the sound of the 20th century. And for the men who once watched the yellow ghost take flight above Rechlin, that sound, the rhythm of mass, precision, and inevitability was the requiem of an age when courage could no longer outrun production, and the sky itself had chosen its victor. 17 years after the war's end, the world that had once burned was rebuilt in chrome and neon. Factories that had forged engines now made cars, aircraft, and refrigerators. Germany was a divided country, its western half humming with reconstruction, its eastern half buried under ideology and ruin. Yet, among the surviving engineers of the Luftwaffe's wartime laboratories, the shadow of one machine still lingered, the Mustang. In November 1962, at a small conference hall near Munich, the Gesellschaft für Luftfahrtforschung convened its annual meeting. The topic, post-war lessons in aeronautical design. The audience was an aging fraternity of men who had once worn eagles on their caps, now in grey suits, some working for NATO contractors, others for civilian firms. The keynote speaker that day was a guest from the United States, Colonel Thomas B. Whitaker, USAF, RET, formerly of the Air Technical Intelligence Division, now attached to North American Aviation. Whitaker's lecture was titled From Laminar-Flow to Jet Supremacy, the Enduring Legacy of the P-51 Mustang. He began without bravado. Gentlemen, he said, you may remember this airplane better than we do. You studied it more carefully than any of our own pilots. The slide projector hummed, casting a familiar silhouette on the screen. The sleek fuselage, the broad laminar wings, the high tail fin. In 1944, Whitaker continued, your test engineers at Rechlin measured the Mustang more precisely than anyone in America. They understood what made it work. What they couldn't change was why it worked. In the audience, Karl Bartels, white-haired now, stooped, his eyes dulled by years of quiet office work, sat motionless. He had received the invitation by accident, forwarded through his employer, Messerschmitt Bölkow Blom. Yet as Whitaker spoke, memories flooded back. The yellow-painted fuselage, the first engine run, the hum that silenced the hangar. Whitaker's voice was steady but not unkind. The genius of the Mustang was not in design but in discipline. It was the first aircraft built as a data problem. Every rivet, every angle, every tolerance served an equation. No heroics, no improvisation, just production logic. And that, gentlemen, was something the world had never seen before. 1944. He changed the slide. A factory floor appeared rows of women in coveralls, assembling wing spars on jigs, each operation timed to seconds. This was the real secret, Whitaker said. Not laminar flow, not the Merlin. The secret was that these workers could build perfection by the thousands. Bartels scribbled something in his notebook, process as destiny. When the lecture ended, polite applause filled the hall. During the break, Whitaker stood by the coffee urn, answering questions in German. Bartels approached quietly. You don't remember me, he said. Whitaker squinted, then his face softened. Rechlin, he said. You're Bartels. They shook hands. Bartels' grip trembled slightly. I kept your photograph, he said. Of the polished Mustang. It's still on my wall. Whitaker smiled. She's in a museum now, in Dayton, the same plane, still flying. For a long moment, neither man spoke. Around them, the hum of conversation rose and fell, engineers debating supersonic intakes, laminar shocks, turbine tolerances. The new century's problems. But between the two men lingered the echo of piston engines and propeller arcs, of an age when victory could be measured in revolutions per minute. Bartels finally said, "You know, when we studied your Mustang, we believed we were looking 20 years into the future. Now, it's 20 years later, and it still feels that way." Whitaker nodded. "That's because it wasn't just an aircraft. It was a blueprint for how to build the future itself." Later that afternoon, Whitaker presented one final slide. A photograph from the Wright-Patterson archives showing the German test report from 1944, Geheime Kommandosachse NR 547. Across its cover, a typed line read, "The decisive factor is not technical knowledge but industrial method." Whitaker gestured toward it. "You wrote that," he said, glancing toward Bartels. "And you were right. We built the jet age on that sentence." When the conference ended, Bartels walked alone into the cold Munich evening. Snowflakes spiraled through the air, glittering under the streetlights. He passed a newspaper stand. The headlines were about Cuba, rockets, and the edge of annihilation. Humanity had traded propellers for missiles, but the same arithmetic ruled: production, reach, endurance, and control. At the train station, he pulled from his briefcase the worn photograph Whitaker had given him in 1945, the polished Mustang gleaming in sunlight. He studied it once more, tracing the outline of the wing, the clean geometry of its airfoil. It no longer looked like a relic. It looked like the ancestor of everything that came after. In his final notebook entry, written that night, Bartels composed his own epitaph for an era. "We thought war was a contest of courage and invention. It was neither. It was a test of systems. The Mustang proved that an idea, multiplied by machinery, becomes fate. We dreamed in steel, they dreamed in assembly lines. And dreams of that kind cannot be defeated, they can only be inherited." When Bartels died the following year, his papers were donated to the Deutsches Museum in Munich. Among the drawings and reports was a single brass, .50 caliber casing, polished smooth with age. Inside it, a folded slip of paper read, "The hum of the Merlin was not our enemy. It was the sound of the modern world taking flight." And so the story ended not in battle or fire, but in understanding the recognition that the war's true revolution had not been of weapons, but of methods. The men who once measured the Mustang's wings had glimpsed something beyond engineering, the machinery of history itself, turning with the smooth inevitability of a well-tuned engine. April 8, 1985. 41 years to the day after Oberleutnant Ralph Hermachine had laughed at the flying milk bottles over France. A different sky lay above Germany, peaceful, commercial, crisscrossed by contrails of airliners and the slow arcs of civilian jets. Yet that morning, at a small airfield near Göttingen, the past stirred once more. The air smelled of avgas and nostalgia. On the tarmac sat a shape few in Europe had seen since 1945, a fully restored P-51B Mustang. Its fuselage shone silver, its spinner painted red, and beneath the cockpit, someone had carefully stenciled an echo from History T9 plus CK. The aircraft belonged to a private American collector, Colonel Robert Bob Whitaker, Jr., son of the very man who had once walked through the ruins of Rechlin with Karl Bartels. He had inherited his father's fascination with that yellow-bellied ghost of a fighter. After decades of searching, he had located fragments of the original captured Mustang serial 43 to 12102, buried in storage crates at Wright-Patterson and the Deutsches Museum. Using parts from 3 wrecks and the surviving Packard-Merlin engine, he rebuilt the machine not as a replica, but as a resurrection. The flight was part of the 40th anniversary commemoration of the war's end, a joint German-American ceremony dedicated to reconciliation through aviation. Journalists called it Operation Reconciliation. Among the invited guests were surviving engineers, pilots, and historians. Among them sat an elderly woman with grey hair and sharp eyes. Liselotte Bartels, daughter of the Rechlin engineer who had once written, "The hum of the Merlin was the sound of a country that had already won." She held that note in her hands, the paper fragile, the ink faded. As the crowd gathered along the fence, the announcer's voice echoed across the airfield. Today, for the first time in 40 years, a Mustang will fly over German soil not as a weapon, but as a bridge. The Merlin engine coughed once, twice, then caught with the same even purr that had stilled a hangar in 1944. Heads turned. Veterans wept silently. The aircraft taxied forward, tail wagging slightly on the uneven pavement. The propeller blurred, the note deepened, and with a smooth, almost lazy grace, T9 plus CK lifted from the runway and began to climb. The silver wings caught the morning sun, and for a moment the crowd could not tell if they were watching history or memory. Inside the cockpit, Whitaker Jr. leveled off at 5,000 feet and pointed north, tracing the same route his father's reports had described 4 decades earlier. The engine thrummed through the headset, steady as breath. He opened the throttle gently, 25 inches, 2,600 revolutions per minute, the same settings the Rechlin engineers had recorded in their test logs. The aircraft responded exactly as the old documents had promised, smooth, eager, untroubled. Down below, the spectators craned their necks as the Mustang performed a slow roll, then a shallow dive that ended in a thunderous pass over the runway. The sound struck the chest more than the ear, a physical vibration that rolled through the valley. It was the same sound that had haunted German ground troops in 1944, the one they had called Donnerschlag thunderclap. But today, it carried no terror, only awe. Among the audience stood a small group of former Luftwaffe pilots' men who had once faced Mustangs in the war's last bitter months. One of them, now frail and leaning on a cane, whispered to another, "Back then, that noise meant death. Now it means we survived it." After landing, Whitaker taxied to a stop beside a row of modern jets, sleek, quiet, anonymous. When the engine shut down, the silence that followed felt heavier than the roar had been. He climbed down, greeted by applause and camera flashes. Liselotte Bartels approached slowly, clutching her father's note. "My father wrote about your plane," she said softly. "He called it the mirror of our defeat." Whitaker smiled gently. "Maybe today it can be the mirror of our peace." She handed him the note. The paper trembled in the breeze. He read the last line aloud, his voice catching slightly. "The hum of the Merlin was not our enemy. It was the sound of the modern world taking flight." He folded it carefully and placed it inside the cockpit map case. Then, "Let's keep it flying," he said. Later that evening, as the sun sank behind the hangars of Göttingen, the Mustang was towed into a hangar lit by amber light. Its shadow stretched across the concrete, sleek, timeless, impossibly modern. For a moment, it seemed less a relic than a prophecy fulfilled. A machine born in war, now preserved by peace. Outside, the air cooled, and the last vapor trails of jetliners glowed red against the twilight. The same sky that had once carried death now carried travelers, commerce, and communication, the industrial dream that both sides had glimpsed in the Mustang's polished wings. When the lights dimmed, the airfield grew quiet again. The Mustang's propeller gleamed faintly in the dark, still and perfect. And in that silence, if one listened closely, there seemed to linger a faint vibration, a ghost of that flawless hum from April 1944, when the world first heard, without understanding, the sound of its own future.